needs 200 people to show up. We're waiting for an introduction, I think. I'll start my vaudeville act in just a minute if they're not ready.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. On behalf of Father Charles and everyone here at the CIC, we're so grateful to have both of you here. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to Emmett to introduce you.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming here. We want to extend our gratitude to Father Trujillos and the Catholic Information Center, not only for co-hosting this with Belmont Abbey College, but also for the great work it does here in Washington. I'm executive director of the Belmont House in Washington, D.C., and we have here today the issue that we're talking about today, or the book, is All the Kingdoms of the World, which addresses some important hot-button issues for civil society and the church. So we're looking forward to a rich discussion. The author, Kevin Vallier, here is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University and Director of its program on philosophy, politics, economics, and law. He is the winner of the 2023 Philosophy of Religion Prize from the Mark Sanders Foundation. Professor Vallier received his bachelor's in cognitive science and philosophy from Washington University in St. Louis, and his doctorate of philosophy from the University of Arizona. Our interlocutor this evening is Dr. Joseph Wysocki, Associate Professor of Government and Political Philosophy at Belmont Abbey College, and Dean, I might add, the founding Dean of its Honors College. The Honors College has enjoyed increased enrollment each year since its founding in 2018, including during COVID. Dr. Wysocki earned a bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Belmont Abbey College, and a doctorate in political science from Baylor University. He is co-founder of the college's Belmont House on Capitol Hill. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe and Kevin.
Well, thank you, Emmett, and thank you to the CIC and to all of you for coming. I know it's tough to get away in the evenings, and even for great events, it's time. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Kevin, for this book. I had a great pleasure in reading it. I was just speaking to Ashok before we began here, and he was asking me, what is your interest in the topic of this book? And for me, one of the real personal interests is that a lot of my young students who are coming to Belmont Abbey, young, pious, Orthodox Catholic students, have become very interested in integralism, which is something that I, going to Catholic college and hanging out with lots of Orthodox good young students, had never heard of. And so really wanting to understand this new phenomenon that's come on the scene, and so I can better understand my students, really. But I want to talk a little bit about the book before we get into the question of integralism and just some of the accomplishments that I think are really wonderful about this book. So I want to just mention these briefly to encourage you to go and to read it. First, I think Professor Vallier is able to really blend in this book sort of speaking to two different audiences. He'll talk about three other audiences later on, but what I mean is that he's able to write this for beginners who are really not well-versed in political philosophy, in what integralism is, what new natural law theory is, and to sort of show them what's at stake, what is going on in a very introductory way, and yet to also blend that with academic rigor for those of us who want to really go deeper into understanding the sort of more technical side of this debate about Catholic politics and anti-liberal politics. The book also provides an excellent history for those of us who don't know church history, which I put myself in that category. I find that my friends who are Eastern Orthodox know church history better than Catholics almost always, because they've chosen something that's not a major religion in America. So all my friends that are Orthodox, they know it so well. But you did a very good job, I think, in giving us highlights of the history of Catholic political or church-state relations, and in particular, an excellent account of what was at stake in Vatican II's teachings on religious liberty and church-state relations. The third thing that I think is maybe most important is that he begins with in my view, a charitable defense of the integralist position, of the anti-liberal position, which, as some of you, if you're familiar with this public debate that's going on, in many ways, both sides are less than charitable, especially on social media, and provides a good account of why people would be attracted to this position, right? A non-reductive view of why people would be attracted to some of these positions. He follows this with I think, very thorough critique of integralism at both the theoretical and practical level. And finally, as a good liberal, but really as a good Christian, he attempts to try to come up with some sort of peace, present us with some sort of alternative for reconciliation that is not a cheap reconciliation, right? A word that he uses often, right? Some sort of modus vivendi, right? But to try to propose a way forward that takes anti-liberals seriously and tries to respond to some of their concerns while maintaining a liberal political order. So there's much more in the book, but I think those things are quite important accomplishments and makes the book
Thanks.
very worthy of praise. Yeah. So maybe I'll begin with a question about what integralism is, and I'll begin with my own sort of, very quickly, my own political journey. As a serious Catholic who was interested in politics, I studied political science as an undergrad and graduate student, and somebody who loved both America, in a moderate way, saw its flaws, loved America, loved its Constitution, was moderately patriotic, but also wanted to take the teachings of the Church seriously and what it had to add to political life. For me, the way that I heard that one ought to do that was to try to, using legitimate means, incorporate the teachings of the natural law into the positive law through legislation and through maybe sometimes even in interpreting the Constitution. Although I know there's a debate between even folks like Scalia and Hadley Arquez, neither of whom are integralists, but who on how much a judge should be able to incorporate the natural law. But this is not enough for integralists, right? Like that pathway is not enough. So maybe why is that the case? Why do they need something more than that view of using the natural law to help correct the deficiencies in the American liberal order?
Yeah, again, thanks to all of you who came, and to Joe and to Emmett and to Mary for helping to put this together. So the answer to your question, I think, has a couple of different pieces. The first is like why there was what this view is and why there was a demand for it. So Catholic integralism, as I understand it, is actually a pretty old and pretty common view about church-state relations in the Catholic Church, from roughly at least the 11th century down into the early 20th. And it's saying, okay, look, here's kind of three conditions, two things that we probably all accept, which is first that God has ordained the state to promote the temporal common good of its members. And the second claim is also similarly clear, that God has ordained the church to bring about the supernatural or spiritual good of its baptized members and to preach the gospel beyond that. What the integralists add is an idea that you see in Pius IX and Leo XIII, but that receives its most detailed and famous articulation by Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who, as you know, was, I believe, beatified in 1930 and a doctor of the church in 1931, even though he's a 17th century figure. And he developed this idea of what he called the indirect power of the Pope. See, at the time, there were kind of two sort of hardcore positions about papal versus royal authority. You had a kind of, sometimes called Gallicanism, Erastianism, or Caesaropapism, that said that the crown had ecclesiastical authority. He could appoint bishops, he could try clerics in his own courts, and the church wanted to reject that, as you can imagine, and had for a long time. But there's also another position that sometimes gets called hierocracy, where the Pope has tremendous temporal power, and oftentimes quite direct. For instance, the ability to make or unmake kings. And Bellarmine pushes back against both of these positions. He says that the Pope has a kind of indirect sovereignty over the church in spiritual affairs. So integralism isn't theocracy in the sense that sort of clerics rule. Rather, it's that the superiority of the church's mission means that a Christian state should make its jurisdiction available for religious ends. So, for instance, if a heretic is excommunicated, right, receives spiritual punishments, doesn't respond, say, in a certain amount of time, the church can direct, say, the civil power to punish the heretic for civil reasons. Now, that's actually, in the case of heresy, a kind of extreme case. But the thought here is that the Pope and his bishops have this kind of indirect authority over Christian states in order to direct them, to use them as the church's sort of what's called their secular arm. So the idea then is that you kind of combine the discipline of the canon law with the sort of backing up of civil law. And this is taken to almost follow from the fact that the church is superior, that both powers are ordained by God, and so the one must, at least in some limited cases, serve the other. So we're like, really think about what makes it distinctive, is the idea that the superiority of the church's ends implies something about sovereignty. Right? It implies that the church has a limited sovereignty over the state. So that's how I understand integralism, is the two moments of authorization from God and then the integrated indirect sovereignty of the church over the state.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment a little bit on what Vatican II throws into the mix here and the interpretations of that?
And that'll help me set up a little bit about why I think this has come back. And why so many young people are attracted to it, since you'd asked about that. So even down into the early 20th century, you've got a lot of people defending the indirect power. In fact, I mean, the early Maritain in the Primacy of the Spiritual, I think it's 1927, is saying nice things about the indirect power. I think there's a good case to be made that Pius IX and Leo XIII thought that this was something like the ideal church-state relations. But a host of events start to happen in Europe, including the two world wars, where the church really wants to join the international order, the order of human rights, and to be a power that shapes Europe culturally and spiritually. It's also the case that there are a variety of debates about, say, theological liberalism that had become more powerful, and the influence of sort of liberal democratic regimes broadly in terms of universal religious freedom. And there was also a sort of pressure, the thought that Catholics were disloyal to these regimes because ultimately they wanted the Pope to rule. There are a number of other sort of tributaries, but into the river of the Second Vatican Council. But they kind of combined there into the production of its most controversial document, which is Dignitatis Humanae, or its Declaration on Religious Freedom. It was drafted and redrafted many times. There's a huge amount of disagreement about it. And this included, liberals like followers of John Courtney Murray, more traditionalist people that wanted to reject it, and even the most radical folks like Archbishop Lefebvre, who ultimately rejected the council in part because of the rejection of the doctrine of religious liberty, as he explains in his book, They Haven't Crowned Him. And then you had these sort of Maritanians that were maybe more moderate. And the view that ends up coming out, it says that there isn't a discontinuity with earlier tradition in the first article. But in the second article, it says that there's a universal right of religious freedom, and that it's based in the dignity of the person, and that that's revealed not only by revelation, but by reason. And so it looks like the church no longer is saying that it has any indirect sovereignty over the state. It's not saying that the church isn't superior to the state. It's not saying that the church is in submission to the state. But it is saying the church is not going to, and maybe never should have, engaged in that kind of directive power over the baptized members of a polity, state polity. And so it looks like if you read, for instance, Leo XIII's encyclical Immortale Dei, that's 1885. We got Dignitatis Humanae in 1965. Over 80 years, there seems to be a really radical change in church doctrine. In fact, it's pretty high up there in cases that look like there's a real discontinuity in terms of Catholic teaching. And so there's been questions since the Second Vatican Council, okay, well, how do we make sense of what happens? And as we were discussing on the way over, there were traditionalists and progressives that said, look, this is a rupture, right? And the progressives say that's good, and the traditionalists say that's bad. And what happens in a lot of the traditionalist communities is they begin to take a very oppositional stance towards the council, in part because they want to reject or downplay Dignitatis Humanae. So that's one of many, many reasons. And so what starts to develop, and this is one of the things I created the interest in integralism, is that many of the traditionalists took a very oppositional stance towards the hierarchy. And starting in the mid-2000s, particularly in the UK, but a few other places, there are a number of philosophers and theologians, like the great philosophical historian Thomas Pink, as emeritus at King's College London, who wanted to say, well, there was, on the standard way of looking at Dignitatis Humanae, a rupture. But maybe that's not the right reading. Maybe Vatican II is actually consistent with our traditionalist impulses so that we don't have to be in opposition to the church. It's a really big part of integralism as it develops early on, is the sense that we will honor the church, we'll be loyal sons and daughters of the church, while at the same time, we can reject everything liberal that looks even remotely liberal about the church. And this all depended on a new interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae that Thomas Pink advanced. And I can review it pretty briefly, but it's what made integralism intellectually possible for it to return. It isn't what I think caused all the energy, which I'll explain in a moment. So the rough view is that what Dignitatis Humanae is doing is it's talking about the rights of individuals and small groups against the state. And all it's talking about is liberty against the state. In fact, the church explicitly set aside the idea that it was even commenting on the liberty of the church, because the council fathers said, look, we can't even agree on what the powers of the church are over its members. When should we try people? When should we have ecclesiastical courts and so on? So what Pink says is, look, this document is about the relationship between the individual and the state. It's not about the church and the individual. And he thinks, and here's the move where people, I think, object the most and why it's a minority interpretation. He says, and because the church was not addressed in Dignitatis Humanae, for all we know, it is still in principle possible for the church to authorize the state to serve as its secular arm, if the state is Christian. Now, of course, the church has rejected integralism as policy, Pink says, but it hasn't rejected it in principle. And this is extremely important because now Catholics that want to oppose liberalism entirely can believe that they can do so while remaining good sons and daughters of the church. And until Pink, that wasn't really on the table in a big way. And one of the things that happens is that younger people are getting suspicious of liberal democratic order. They've been told for a long time that Catholics would be gradually integrated into liberal democracy, treated, particularly Protestant liberal democracies, that they would be treated with respect and as equals, that the state would try to be neutral between, say, Catholic views on certain issues and other views. And then particularly the early 2000s, with the progress of gay marriage, the progress of the LGBT movement, the thought was, no, this was never true. We should never have trusted the left to tell us that things would be neutral. As soon as they got more cultural power, they wielded it, right? And now, as Catholics, we're back in the position that we were in 50 years ago. We're subordinated, we're looked down upon, mistrusted, despised, and maybe that was built into liberal order all along. Because there had always been Catholics in the U.S. who said, yeah, this accommodation with America, it's never going to work. It can't work. And so a lot of younger people are saying, well, maybe that's true. But they wanted to hold back, I think, because many of them want to be loyal sons and daughters of the church.
Right.
And so the demand for integralism is there because particularly of events in the United States. And the supply is there in terms of the revival of integralist thought and the reinterpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. So about 5 or 6 years after Pink started writing on this, Alan Phimister had organized a conference in Tremont, Austria. And a young Father Edmund Waldstein heard Pink's interpretation and told me, and I asked him that it was a really big moment in him realizing, as a traditionalist Catholic, as a son of 2 Catholic theologians, he graduated from Thomas Aquinas College, who was a Cistercian monk, that he could be loyal to the hierarchy and reject liberalism completely. So in college, he'd been worried about the kind of Whig Thomism of Michael Novak, for instance, and the way that Say First Things was at that time. And so he went, and started to import these ideas among friends of his and people that he knew in the United States. And you had a lot of really prominent people now whose names I won't go through that were part of this movement in 2012 and 2013. And then it just started to blossom on social media as people appealed to the richness of the intellectual tradition. You can draw on Aquinas' De Regno, you can draw on Francisco Suarez, Vittoria, Bellarmine, Leo XIII. And in 2016, when Trump was elected, and the new right had this kind of new stage, something really dramatic happens. You get all these new factions, but there's one that's got a venerable intellectual tradition that extends back for many centuries, right? And it also gives conservatives a way of saying, well, what do we really want? Now we have an ideal. Now we have something to contrast liberalism with. And then it just took off. And many older Catholics will not even acknowledge that it's a thing. And all the young, very online Catholics know exactly what it is. So anyway, that's, again, I wanted to tell the supply story. How did anyone think integralism was on the table? And then tell the demand story about why anyone wanted to hold it. So, yeah.
Thank you. So as you point out in the book, traditional or support for integralism, the theory always understood that this ideal could only be realized in nations that were a majority, large majority Catholic.
Yeah.
And so this movement in the United States, which is not overwhelmingly Catholic, has had to take on a sort of new strategic approach. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe why? One thing that you hit on in the book that I think is really important to get to tonight is your argument that to employ the means that are being advocated in American integralism require someone to enter into grave sin.
Yeah, so I'll take those two things in order. I think they're both pretty important. So one of the things that starts to develop among integralists is whether to sort of take the doctrine political. And there are a number of people who said no, and there were people who said yes, and some of them were on the left economically, and some of them were not. I mean, you had integralist socialists, people identifying as socialists that were integralist. And starting when Trump was first elected, the sort of Trump-leaning people, or the new right-leaning people, began to have more and more influence. And they were the ones saying, let's get involved. We can maybe lead the new right in useful directions. And this was helped by two events, Sohrab Ahmari and Adrian Vermeule's conversions to Catholicism, because they were both really talented, it turned out, at getting the message out, particularly on Twitter. And they continue to have a huge amount of influence. And so the group of the kind of new right integralist, even though Ahmari and Vermeule had been political in lots of different ways before then, you started to just have more and more people that were just really good at communication, that could write well, that communicate effectively, and that knew the ideas. So what do they do if they're confronting a majority Protestant country, and the only place there's really an integralist movement of any significance is the United States? So you're in a weird position, right? When I've interviewed the British integralists, they all say, oh, no, we have to wait until things are overwhelmingly Catholic. We need a massive Catholic revival. So one of the things I think that Vermeulen introduced into American integralism is that he has tended to have something of an elite view of social change, so that elite leadership can have really big impacts on sort of what the folk believe. If you read, for instance, his original essay on common good constitutionalism in the Atlantic, that's pretty clear. And so I think what he thinks, and this is a guess, and I interpret him in a way that tries to give him some ways to say, okay, no, you've got me wrong, is that if integralists can sort of embed themselves in the administrative state and the judiciary, that if liberalism is as corrosive and is as likely to collapse as, say, he and Pat Deneen think, you kind of need people at the right place at the right time, but that you should be able, maybe, right, instead of doing some decentralist thing or some Tolkien kind of thing, you're in a much better position if you're actually trying to rule, and you have a developed theory of rule, and you're engaged in statecraft. And so, Vermeulen's challenging people to say, look, conservatives have been trying to eliminate the administrative state for decades. Mm-hmm. They've totally failed. This is something that we're stuck with, and we've got a choice. Either the people who are right can run it, or the people who are wrong. There's no neutrality. There's no getting rid of the administrative state. So we have to staff it, right? We have to influence it. So I think that's part of the story. The complication, because he has a host of strategic writings over the last 5 years that are kind of in different places, is that any sort of top-down transition strategy is going to run into a host of difficulties. A really big part of their work, I think, is the belief, which they've argued to some extent, that liberalism will kind of fall. Like with many small groups that want power for good or bad reasons, the idea that history will do a lot of your job is pretty common. And Vermeulen's story is interesting. It's a lot more specific than Deneen's. And it works something like this, as far as I can tell. It's laid out in American Affairs. Liberals, in contrast to what most people think, they're not decadent. They're kind of ascetic fanatics. And what they're desperate to do is to liberate. Right? And they start off with reasonable liberations, and slavery and so on and so forth. But they're so addicted to liberations. They're so drawn to it that the liberations get more and more absurd and ridiculous with time. And that isn't going to fundamentally stop. So in the same way, for instance, that the capitalist class in Marxism gets more and more desperate as the rate of profit falls, right? And then eventually they just become so oppressive the whole thing has to collapse. In the same way, the returns to liberation go from slavery to transgender stuff, right? And Vermeulen says you don't even know what's coming next. And the uncertainty, he says, is the point. Because they're trying to create a mechanism of control over most people. The liberals are trying to do this so they can constantly liberate them, which is a way of constantly controlling them. So Vermeulen thinks it's inevitable, given who liberals are, given their essence, what's going to happen. And he has this piece in First Things on Christian Strategy where he kind of lays out, look, you don't sort of take over and dictate. You be a good, say, Jewish leader in a pagan regime, right? So he draws analogies with Daniel or Esther and so on. So what I'm trying to do is trying to figure out what this would even look like if you went, the sort of takeover process would even look like. And one thing to think about, and one thing to understand, is that there are many small political groups who've hypothesized about this stuff. Like, this isn't a conspiracy theory or anything. It's just fitting the standard pattern, right? You have to create a community of like-minded people that kind of understand what's going to happen, right? You have to get them in positions of power so that they're ready when things go wrong. You have to have a theory about why eventually history does the job for you. And then it's just a matter of what you do next. And it's no guarantee. It's not inevitable. But it's so a heck of a lot better than Catholics doing nothing. I think for Vermeulen, Catholics have to learn to rule in the same way that progressives have no problem ruling, right? The Chinese have no objection to statecraft. Why shouldn't Catholics be able to process this? So what I'm trying to do is imagine a society like ours that's at least a little bit liberal, that's sort of broadly democratic in terms of majority rule, that has costless communication, that has high levels of education, and that's complex in the sense that its great institutions are kind of interlinked in a way where it's really hard to predict the effect of how they all interact. And so when you try to imagine a number of the ways that this process would go, I feel like things start to get a little odd or problematic, to sort of put it lightly. So how exactly will this small group of people come to rule? What are the stages? What are the steps? Well, let's assume you could get a foothold in the GOP, which is not true. But you've got to sort of play state party politics. Okay, well, you could do that probably without violating sort of Catholic moral teachings. But eventually this party has to become the state party, right? It can't just keep on trading power with like the woke or whatever. Like that can't happen. The woke won't allow it to happen. I'm putting it in quotes because that's more of their way of thinking about this. So now what you have to imagine is, one, the party or whatever the group is co-opting the state against dissenters, and the fact that the dissenters are almost assuredly going to resist. And in fact, if liberals are every bit as ascetical and fanatical and power addicts as Vermeulen outlines, they're going to resist violently, right? And then you have to start imagining and apply Catholic principles about when violence is permissible. I actually tried one day to take principles of just war theory and then convert them into a just integration theory. And the conditions for a just war are pretty stringent. I mean, if you have a Marxist takeover, the justification for violence is far easier, right? If you're dealing with a fascist takeover, or even, the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? What can the Mujahideen do, right? But Catholicism is far more morally stringent in terms of the use of violence. So they have to somehow establish a one-party state. But they don't have to just do that. They have to clear out the internal opposition. Now, I've looked at some models of ideological or ideology-based governance. And what you find is, if you look at the communists or the fascists or the Islamists, is that first of all, you have to have like a pretty clear structure in terms of how you take over the state and pacify it, which is just totally incompatible with Catholicism. So for instance, you need loyal military troops, so loyal that they can terrify the branches of the military into submission. So the SS, right, the Mujahideen, the brown shirts and so on. You need an incredibly loyal cadre that rules essentially by fear. So that's out, I assume. And you also have to control communications, I think, which is really hard to do without a lot of really, really serious surveillance. And on top of that, there are going to be still some liberals around, right? I mean, like even if it collapses like the Soviet Union, I mean, you're still going to have to clear out all of these bureaucracies so that they aren't sources of internal resistance. Okay, so imagine you could get past the internal resistance without a lot of violence. Now you have to deal with the people outside the state and the kind of resistance they're going to put up, right? There's probably going to be Protestants, there's probably going to be an LGBT community, there's probably going to be all kinds of different groups that see this as an existential threat. And then you start to imagine how you would suppress the external resistors to the state, and it's just not plausible. Okay, so I talk most about the state transition, which I think is just full of problems. But there's something else I'd add to the transitional problem. And this, I think, is just a decisive consideration, because the other stuff, I mean, maybe you can play with a little bit, which is, as far as we know, not one of the Catholic Church's 5,600 bishops is integralist. So how do you revive integralism as policy within the church? Well, you probably got to get an integralist pope, and he's also got to be in a situation where reestablishing integralism is even on his agenda. Mm-hmm. That's a big deal. Both of those steps is almost unimaginable. I mean, what I call high integralism, or the period where integralism was closest to reality, 12th, 13th, 14th century in Western Europe. The culture and relationship between the various bishops is far more narrow. Right? You don't have a global church with bishops from almost every major culture, linguistic group, and so on. The idea that they're all going to coordinate around a policy like this. You've also got to deal, pretty seriously with the idea that you're going to get even a majority of them to be on board with this. And they haven't really outlined, integralists haven't really outlined how they're going to sort of bring the church around. I think the implicit thought is once people see liberalism collapse, they'll have to go back to it. But I think if anything we know about how the sort of international church of the 21st century operates, is that it's a place of diversity and wide disagreement. And remember, that's not even you're not even done then, right? So you got to convert the church, you got to convert the state, and then you have to get them to unite. And you have to get them to unite in a way that the state would be subordinate to the church in at least some things. Now, why would any modern state subordinate itself just for power reasons to the Vatican? Like, why would they do that? Overwhelming cultural influence? Maybe. But the way this happened under high integralism, they were papal states. Right. I mean, the Pope could convince different groups to fight, and I mean that's just unimaginable now. So anyway, it's an interesting story, a transition at the level of 30,000 feet, and I just try to go down to the ordinary politics of it. I just can't see any way to get there without enormous violence. So what I argue, and this is very important, is I don't argue that the integralists relish violence or are obsessed with power or anything like that. The problem is a dilemma of what I call moral feasibility. You can get to integralism, it's feasible, you just have to be willing to do horrible things. And so it's not moral. But if you follow Catholic moral teaching, then it's not feasible. So you see the dilemma there, it's either feasible or moral, but it can't be both. So that's the essence of what I call the transition argument. And that's one of the key problems is that, as I say there, the two arguments we'll talk about, you can't get to integralism, but you also can't stay at it. So the big issue with what I call, that's the transition argument. That's the difficulty of approaching integralism today. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
So I completely understand how this might be very difficult to create in the US.
Yeah.
Is it more likely that it can happen in, say, a much smaller, more homogeneous European country?
I think it certainly is. But I think the difficulty is that I lay out what the sort of modern conditions or what I think of underlying sort of quasi-liberal democratic order is. And the reason that those underlying social conditions create so much difficulty for transition. So it isn't just it would be hard in the United States. It definitely would be harder in the United States. There's no doubt about that at all. But actually one of the things I say near the end of the book is that actually in Eastern Orthodoxy, we do have a quasi-theocratic state. It's the monastic republic of Mount Athos. It's existed for 1,000 years, and it's survived every attempt to destroy it. Even the Soviets. There's 2,000 monks up there. There's a variety of monasteries and even more skeets. They're under the ecumenical patriarch, so they have a ecclesiastical ruler. They're under the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They have a temporal ruler. And they're entirely focused on the spiritual good of the community and the Orthodox Church all around the world. And we've produced, the Orthodox Church has produced many Athonite saints, even very recently. And so I actually think if you went super small, what I call integration writ small, that you could pull this off. The problem is that there are radical libertarians who would be fine with this, right? I mean, if you go to the last chapter of Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, the part on utopia, he says a utopia is a utopia of utopias, right? It's a group of different people living out their different utopias. So if you get it really small and people can leave and exit, and you have a system where lots of groups can do this, you can call that integralism if you want. I mean, you can. And then I think, if you have a federation of these kinds of groups. But there's also problems keeping an integralist because the costs of exit are just so low. So if you start to impose a lot of these policies, it just seems more likely that people would leave. It's just so easy to move around compared to high Middle Ages. Particularly, you'll just know about these things because communication, education. And then an interesting question would be, what would it be like to have a very small integralist community in a broader set of small communities? I think that's a really interesting problem kind of analytically. But so yeah, my view is the smaller you get and the more homogeneous you get, the more integralist you can get, but then you have to deal with the exit issue. So I'm not sure what the equilibrium would be.
I wonder, I've been thinking about even the small state possibility and with a supermajority of Catholics and thinking, is there any regime in which an overwhelming majority of Catholics, for example, agree with the Church's teaching on contraception, right? Like even in America now, like what is the percentage there?
Yeah.
And so if an integralist regime were to, get your own house in order first, right? I mean, okay, yeah, sure, we're fine with this indirect power for a while until there's a law that says we're going to go back to pre-Griswold v. Connecticut days in the United States, and and I know a lot of integralists sort of prudentially say, we're not going to push that
Yes,
too quickly.
that's right.
And,
That's right.
So to be fair, right,
Yeah.
there is a sense of restraint on a lot of those things, and,
That's right.
and they are prudential, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm willing to grant the integralists that you could have a lot of cultural change. I just grant that. There's no reason in principle that all of these movements towards the left on social issues are inevitable. So no, I grant there can be big changes. The question is, are they the kinds of changes that would establish an integralist regime? Now, if many integralists say, "Oh, well, we can certainly do a lot better than we're doing," and I would say, well, yeah, but why do you need integralism for that? Because one of the things I say towards the end of chapter 4 is if you look at sort of Catholic moral thought, say the principles of the common good, human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, those are kind of the big four, according to Russ Hittinger, moral principles. You can figure out how to improve society without an ideal, right? You don't need to talk about integralism, right? You don't need any of it. To think, for instance, that Viktor Orban has some good ideas on governance, you don't need integralism. I mean, he's a Calvinist. So, it's kind of strange because I actually don't think integralism actually helps you figure out how to arrive at it, right? It's at the very most just a claim about what the best regime would be. And so I don't think it actually is a very effective ideal in terms of helping guide you toward it. I think it's just it's unnecessary for Catholics to be good Catholics in politics. It's like, what good is this except to say, here's what would be best.
Well, you and I have been going all day,
Yeah.
so why don't we
Yeah.
turn it over to? Is that a 5-minute warning or 10?
Oh,
Okay.
10.
Okay. Well, let's turn it over to the
Yeah.
audience.
Well, your whole narrative you paid is brilliant, and I commend you for diving so deep into it and coming from a different apostolic communion. But what you said, what you ended there with was interesting. That you don't really see the need for an ideal to guide prudential action.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say to an objection to that through analogical reasoning that, like in our individual spiritual life, one of the main purposes of the coming of Christ was to give us an ideal, knowing that we could never get to that. But kind of the core of the Christian spiritual life is to try to imitate this ideal.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, at the individual level, that's completely correct. The interesting question about a political ideal, though, is it's a story about how the pieces of the sort of human social world all fit together and would work together. So, I mean, and of course, this is true about the church in a way, but there's a certain sense in which the accessibility of individual spiritual progress is kind of much more within our grasp than the operations of a state under anything like modern conditions. So I would point out that there is an analogy, but there's also an important disanalogy. But actually, I address this in great detail in the book. So I say in principle, yes, you want to say, look, there's an ideal in the spiritual life, and it actually extends to the political life. So let me briefly explain. Like the reason I call this all the kingdoms of the world, like drawing on Matthew 4, there's a reason that I think unless you read the book, you don't understand why. So you can look at this temptation of Christ in two different ways. One is this kind of liberal anti-power way, being offered power and saying no. But this actually wasn't always how Catholics interpreted this. There's one point at which, in the High Middle Ages, many people thought, oh, look, Satan's actually offering like all the kingdoms of the world to Jesus because he controls them, right? And so the thought was, look, the church has to exorcise the state. It has to grace the state, or else these are going to be terrible, tyrannical, chaotic, immoral, decadent regimes. And so the whole point of calling it this is that the title is a kind of Rorschach test for how you think about politics, right? And Christians can think about it in two ways. One is you lay down power, and the other is you have to take it up because it's part of the Great Commission, right? So again, that's why I called the book what I called it. I actually don't have in principle a problem with the idea that we should push for a Christendom, or the idea that we should try to convert people, or that we should try to build institutions that make virtue easier. That's not my objection. The interesting question for me is whether the integralist ideal as articulated is a good ideal. That's the key question. That's what chapters 5 and 6 are about. So you look at the internal conditions that integralists set for the ideal, and then I try to show there's two things about them. One, they can't be jointly stable in the way that integralists want, and two, they can't be jointly just. So what you want in an ideal is it to be a just order, and I argue that integralism is neither just nor an order. So I want to allow that there could be a Christian political ideal, and just say it is an integralism. Yeah.
I'll show my bias here. My second to last son's middle name is Antonin, so you kind of know where I stand on some of these questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, I mean, one of the things that has always struck me is your analogy is an interesting one. But
And important.
yeah, can we the means politically to help people to imitate Christ?
Yeah.
Right. We were talking about this earlier in the day. Right. To help young men to avoid temptation when it comes
Yeah.
to pornography.
We had a good
Right?
conversation
How
about
many
this.
of these, there are so many means available, I think, within
Yeah.
our American constitutional system. If you understand the police powers of the state rightly understood, if you understand our constitutional system, right, and not in the way that the 14th Amendment's been interpreted so badly in the last 50 years, there's a lot of aid, I think, that we can even call politically within the system we have. It's just that we have a bad understanding of what those means are in our regime. But,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. We'll go to the
there-
question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
So when you talked about Adrian Review,
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with his work.
Mhm.
I'd just like to know your opinion. So it appears to be the case that he's proposing a kind of Catholic long march for the institutions, and then once Catholics seize control of the institutions, then they can use their institutions to serve Catholic purposes.
Yes, absolutely.
It occurred to me, it sounds a little bit like Boromir in the Lord of the Rings, saying that we should use
Yes.
the ring for good purposes.
Yeah.
So do you think that's an accurate analogy?
So I've called it the Boromir option a few times, but actually I have a somewhat different Tolkien-esque analogy. You're Isildur, okay, and you know there's no way to destroy the ring. Just assume there's no Mount Doom or whatever. You can't destroy the ring, right? There's just no option. Okay. So when I think about integralist politics, particularly Vermeulen, I think he literally thinks you can't destroy the ring. I mean, you can't destroy political power. Modern sovereignty exists for technological reasons, for military reasons. It's just not going to go away. And so it's the world in which you can't destroy the ring. Now, okay, so you have the ring, okay, and here's your option set. You can learn to use it, even though it might corrupt you, or you can give it to Sauron. Well, what do you do? It's an ugly choice. But if you can't get rid of the ring, you probably should try to learn to use it well. And so conservatives need to learn, and particularly Catholic conservatives, need to get over their aversion to rules. So much so that Vermeulen's not a very big Tolkien fan. Read another book, as he once tweeted. So yeah, I mean, he thinks this is why he talks, periodically he'll sort of drop some of the sovereignty theorists he's reading. So recently, he's using this language of ragion de stato, which I think begins with Botero. So you have all these sovereignty theorists, and this is his critique of some of the decentralist integralists, is like, medieval France did not have sovereignty. It kind of hid the ball in terms of, who was ultimately sovereign. But I think for Carl Schmitt type reasons, he just thinks there always is a sovereign. Like, you can't avoid that. There's no way to rule that out. In the same way, there's no way to get rid of power. There's no way to get rid of sovereignty, right? Sovereign power. And so, look, Catholics have to learn to rule, because someone else will rule if Catholics don't learn to rule. So you just have to accept the assumption that you can't destroy the ring, and then everything falls into place, right? Once you understand what he thinks the feasible options are, my big objection is I just think there's tons of social scientific evidence against the elite-led model of social change. I do think elites matter a lot, but then they disagree, and then everything starts to change. But yeah, that's I think the, unfortunately, extended answer to your question. You can't destroy the ring, so what do you do? Yeah. Yes, Julia, all right.
So, at the end of your book, you have an interesting discussion of two alternative anti-liberalisms.
Yeah.
From a Buddhist perspective and from Islamic democratic.
Confucian and Islamic, yeah.
Right, sorry.
Yeah.
Confucian. I was interested why you don't bring up the Christian alternative, the Eastern Orthodox.
Uh-huh.
Alternative. And I'm interested in your thoughts on modern Russia.
Yeah, so I get asked this question periodically, and I have a kind of evasive response, which is that I've been Orthodox a few years. That when I was introduced to Catholic political thought, I was 19, and I started learning it from Ed Feser back when he first left libertarianism for a kind of Thomistic conservatism. So I'm just way more familiar with, even though I'm Orthodox, I'm way more familiar than I am with Catholic political thought than Orthodox political thought. And so I just haven't thought enough about it. But there's another problem too, which is that the circumstances that produced rigorous political thought in Western Europe just did not exist in the East to the same extent. So the impulse for political theorizing, you've got Pope versus Crown, where there's actually a question of who's supreme. You've got popes versus councils, when there's a question of who's supreme. You've got Parliament versus the Crown, where there's all of these questions that Protestants and Catholics are basically forced to write treatises on to figure out, well, who's got it right. Whereas in the East, at least for a long time, you have a pretty stable state. You have a lot of apostolic sees, so tons of bishops that have authority, right? And so the question of who's superior is just not really on the table for as long. And then, it's not as if Christendom internally collapses, but it's just conquered from without. And so a lot of the questions that arise in Western thought that get theorized are not as well theorized in the East. In fact, I had a very distinguished Orthodox historian tell me that Orthodox really haven't learned to think politically in a distinctive way since the fall of Constantinople. And so there's not as much to dig into, but part of the problem is there's not as much translated. I mean, what a lot of folks don't understand is, the Orthodox Church had about the worst 20th century a church of any kind could have. And so many educational institutions were destroyed. Erdogan has suppressed even the Ecumenical Patriarch Seminary. And there's so much that hasn't been translated. It's staggering. Our sort of second holy book, the Philokalia, which is a collection of the sayings of the fathers and monastic wisdom. We didn't even have a full, really good English edition of this until really, I think, even a few years ago. So we're just staggeringly far behind. It's kind of almost where European Catholicism was after the Napoleon, just totally decimated. So there's a lot I don't know, and there's a lot I can't know yet because I don't read Russian and Greek. There's some interesting, important theologians that have some political thought, but it's not all that specific to this question. Okay, so then what do I think about modern Russia? Oh, it's just painful. I think most of the Orthodox Church disagrees with Kirill's political decisions. But before the war, there were many Orthodox who thought, you know what? Putin's a whole heck of a lot better than what came before. He's built something like 30,000 churches, monasteries, and seminaries for a Russian ruler. Come on, so I had parishioners who thought, he's brutal, but at least he's our kind of brutal. That's not great, but you got to understand, in Russia, the option set, again, is not as good. But since the war began, a lot of Orthodox parishes and stuff are just really not talking about it. And I do have very serious reservations with the extent to which the Russian Orthodox hierarchy has kind of gone along with the war. Although to be fair, most churches, Protestant, Catholic, or whatever, oftentimes tend to go along with who's ever in power. So I don't know how much worse we are off than that. But yeah, just praying a lot for Russia and Ukraine, really worried about the schism. I've been thinking a whole lot about questions about kind of how this got going. And a lot of it has to do with the EP deciding to grant the Thomas of Autocephaly to the Ukraine, and the Russian church thinking that can't be done because only they can grant autocephaly as an independent national or local church, rather, as we would put it. And some people think that was actually a precipitating cause of the war, because part of Putin's sort of broader strategy was to use the Orthodox Church to build the Russian world, and that the Ecumenical Patriarch deprived him of this. And the whole Russian church was incensed. And so, but once you get into intra-Orthodox politics, there's so little reporting on it that's any good, and people have no grasp of Orthodox theology at all. I mean, y'all are Catholic, like, you know how bad the press is at Catholic theology, right? Like, can you imagine? So anyway, that's a long answer but the short answer is I'm really struggling with it, and I really want to learn more before I say anything. Yeah.
So I have my question is about it's sort of about the anthropology of the integrals.
They love to talk about it. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking. So this is a little instructional, but it would seem like the personalism of John Paul II would not fit very well with integralism, but also along those same lines, the sense of privacy and property that we have. Like, it doesn't seem to me like so you brought up the example of ethos, and there isn't, that's not a society that's built on a sense of property,
Yeah.
and what these
Or privacy, really.
or privacy, yeah. And throughout the Middle Ages, I think there's we were talking before the church had a strong moral role in sort of stabilizing Europe, but it's because there was this disinterested, the monastic and the orders didn't have those interests, didn't have property interests, and so that they weren't interested in politics. I mean, they were to some extent.
Yeah.
But there was a disinterest that gave them an authority.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, like, it seems, what's the role of the individual? What's the role of freedom as, I think you could argue that John Paul II recognized that there's a tradition of freedom in the spirituality of Christianity, and saw that as a good. And recognized that the tradition was always there and it was good and it was a positive. Like, freedom is something that we have to have. It's part of what it means to be human. And there just doesn't seem to be that role of freedom and creativity in the integralism.
So this is a very rich question, and something on which they've reflected at some length. In fact, in some ways more than almost anything else. First, with respect to freedom, and then respect to personalism, because there are many personalisms, and John Paul II's personalism comes through the influence of phenomenology, and then it traces itself back to Kant, which is one of the reasons I think that he so liked the language of dignity and the dignity of the person. And the integralists tend to stress the common good and almost never talk about dignity. If you read, for instance, Adrian Vermeule's Common Good Constitutionalism, I don't want to say the word dignity doesn't appear, but it almost does not appear. They very much want the common good to be in the justificatory driver's seat of different policies, even though the language of dignity of the person is the sort of official theology of the church. Maybe not dogma, but the official theology, the way the church talks about itself. It talks about both dignity and the common good. The way they try to neutralize this is a little odd, and it's something I wanted to write on for a while. So they go back to de Koninck's debate with Maritain. Whether it was a debate is another debate. The primacy, I wish that was the exact title, the primacy of the common good against the personalists. Yeah, and so they say, look, the dignity of the person is like derivative of the common good, because ultimately what gives us dignity is our capacity for corporate union in Christ. And I think they think that if they put the common good in the driver's seat of moral explanation, then once they explain dignity won't lead to anti-integralist conclusions. Like, the dignity of the individual will be so rooted in the common good and the internal good that it won't have all these kind of like individual rights implications. The problem is it's that second step where they've told us almost nothing. They've talked a lot about, like particularly Chad Pecknold has talked a lot about that first step, right? Getting the basis of sort of the dignity of the person right and not having it be so individualist. But I'm still waiting for them to fill out that next step, because you could have this foundation of the dignity of the person and it still have all the same implications downstream. So anyway, so that's one thing they say. They've got this social anthropology that's rooted in the common good, and dignity isn't a constraint on it. Okay. Now, freedom, and political philosopher, I'm trying not to get too in the weeds, but it's actually pretty interesting. So they totally reject the importance of like negative freedom or freedom from interference. And what they really want is this classical ideal of positive liberty, not the kind of liberty that you see in like Franklin Roosevelt, like freedom from fear or something, but it's the freedom of reason. It's the ability of self-mastery. And they think that's compatible with some forms of coercion because the law functions as a teacher. And this is something they draw, and particularly Pink draws from Suarez, the idea that there can be indirect coercion of the will. Right? You can't like force people to believe things. What you can do is use coercion to put them in an environment where their capacity for reason is more easily formed. Now, many of us would agree with this, right? Like a child grows up surrounded by pornography, like their ability to live a free and rational life is like way more in danger. It's just the integralists go way further. They say, but that's going to be true of pornography, and it's also going to be true of Calvin's institutes. The thought is there's lots of different things that could get in the way, and you've got to kind of clear those things out. So anyway, I think they have a doctrine of freedom, and I think they have a doctrine of the person and dignity. I just think that I really wish they had some like treatises, some really thick books really working this out, but I think that's what they'd say.
Anyone who hasn't gone? Yeah. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet that would like to?
Eileen, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. I think you were asking where you see where I see the intellectual energy of this movement going. So this is also an extremely interesting question because there really are these two groups of integralists that I distinguish between the strategists who are very American and concerned with American politics, and then the theorists who are much more concerned with the theory, but they're also more concerned with church renewal and reform. So if you look at what, say, Vermeulen and Pink, the kind of two leading intellectual lights of the movement, are doing right now, what's Pink doing? He's writing really careful essays on like how to criticize popes and how to do so piously and when Catholics have an obligation to do so. His entire project is church-facing. The whole thing is church-facing. And the integralism stuff and the stuff he's writing now are continuous with his goal. Whereas Vermeulen's project has been politics-facing, right? It's state-facing, right? And so what you see there is because the vagaries of politics, are many, it's like they're constantly trying to maneuver themselves in ways that allow them to have more influence, but they kind of quickly shift gears depending on kind of what happens. So for a while, they're trying to work with the national conservatives, even though they're not really nationalists, which created some tensions. And now they're kind of trying to develop this sort of socially conservative, economically liberal quadrant of American politics. And so, you've got Amari's Tyranny, Inc., and the Restoring a Nation conference last year, Vermeulen declaring the New Deal a great success. And so, it's almost like each year, every 2 years, there's kind of like a different plot. I don't want to maybe use a nicer word. There's a different plan or a different strategy. And I think they don't end up working very well. And one of the reasons, and if any of them are watching, sorry guys, but I have to say this, they're just not very good at alliances. I mean, they're just not really good at it. I mean, they try to work with people and then they end up fighting with them and then they have to get along with other people. So the intellectual energy I think will continue, but I don't know what happens politically because there's no way to predict what they're going to do because you don't know what's going to happen in terms of American politics. Are they going to support Trump 2024? Are they going to be on the sidelines? I have no idea. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think they know. So, yeah, as far as that, I mean, one thing they are doing, though, I think that will continue is the building of the community, particularly with conferences and bringing in more and more academics. So one of their, I think, biggest coups was bringing Deneen on. Because 5 years ago, you can see online, there was an interview that Philip Munoz did with Deneen, Papin, and Vermeulen. And Deneen says integralists are crazy. And Vermeulen says, well, what about as an ideal? Which is kind of what gave me some of the ideas for the book. But now they're thick as thieves.
Well, and even for people who aren't part of the political movement necessarily, to have someone like gosh, what's it, like Scott Hahn
Yep.
participating at their conference,
Yep.
right? And that's mainstream. Scott Hahn is
That's a big deal.
mainstream Catholic
Very big
theologian,
deal.
right? Who's loved by people who are integralists and people who are definitely not integralists.
Yep.
And so that can sort of, even if he's not take over the administrative state for Catholicism,
Yeah.
his presence there means a whole lot. Right?
They've also got Fazer writing at post-liberal order. And I mean, Fazer is one of the great living apologists of the Catholic Church in terms, particularly against atheism. Was massively influential on me. I mean, of living figures, of people, philosophers alive, no one influenced me more than Ed did. And to see him working with post-liberal order has been very, very surprising.
I was getting the signal that I think we're about out of time, but we can still continue with. Can we
Yeah,
still continue
I'd
with
love to keep
informal
talking. I'd love to keep
convers-
talking.
yeah, okay.
And I mean, just let me say again, thank you. I've tried really, really hard in the book to explain this doctrine, to give it a fair shake. But I wanted to tell you one reason that I did it, just briefly. Ultimately, I think right now the American church is living on a kind of captivity. And we're captive to kind of very rigid political thinking, right? Very much in-group, out-group, red versus blue. And I've thought a lot about, because I've written a lot on trust and polarization and difficulties in the United States, about what would break the church out of this, right? What would do it? What would renew our thinking? And you know something the integralists pulled off that's pretty weird, but kind of cool? And I know I'm saying this, I get in trouble with my friends for saying this, but like, they kind of broke it. Like, they kind of broke us out of it to some extent. And they're kind of much more, even though, I mean, they're intellectually independent in a weird way. And I just wanted other Christians to have better views, but that have the same daring, right? It's to say, look, we need to be doing more political theology. And so I wrote this and to try to explain, like, well, here's kind of my take as a political philosopher about how we can do that. But I hope that other people join in from different disciplines. I want everyone to be part of this new and energetic conversation. It doesn't have to be limited to integralism, and the church needs it.
I mean, this would be something like, say, Gladden Papin's economic policies, like building coalitions with Democrats, maybe, or to break out of the polarization.
Well, I think the first stage is intellectually and spiritually, is to say, okay, look, my parents who are Christians are like always angry because they're watching Fox News all the time. Like, why are my friends that are Christians watching Fox News more than they're praying and studying Scripture? Like, what's going on? I mean, we have the wrong priorities, right? So I think I'm grateful to the integralist for kind of breaking us out and creating this energy that I think we can take in a variety of fruitful directions. So.
All right. Well, yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you again. We're so honored to have you guys here. After this, we're going to have a light reception until 8 o'clock, and they'll be available to sign books and talk more one-on-one. So the conversation will continue.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Squeeze in a little bit. Yeah. Question. Yeah. So, I come into this because of the work of the
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not going to be